Neste momento, convidamos para compor a mesa desta solenidade Bjorn Lomborg. Welcome. Acadêmico, ambientalista e escritor dinamarquês, é autor do polêmico best-seller O Ambientalista Cético, professor adjunto na Copenhague Business School e ex-diretor do Instituto de Avaliação Ambiental em Copenhague. Fundou em 2002 o Consenso de Copenhague, do qual é diretor. Promove uma campanha não convencional sobre as alterações climáticas. Ele se opõe ao protocolo de Quioto e outras medidas para reduzir as emissões de gás carbônico a curto prazo. E argumenta que deveríamos nos adaptar às altas temperaturas, já que elas são inevitáveis, e investir em pesquisa e desenvolvimento a longo prazo de soluções ambientais, bem como sobre outros problemas do mundo importantes como a AIDS, malária e desnutrição. Senhoras e senhores, Bjorn Lomborg.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to talk to you about how we actually think about global warming and how we act on global warming. And I'm also just going to get rid of this so I don't look like a fool. Fundamentally, I think we need to remember, if we're going to talk about global warming, we need to think about what is it we want? Well, presumably, we want to do something that actually does good about global warming and not just make us feel good. I don't know if you noticed, we were all supposed to turn out our lights for 1 hour this Saturday evening. I don't know how many of you did it, but apparently 1 billion people around the world did so. Much of Sydney, many locations around the world turned off their power for an hour, turned off all the lights, and everyone felt very, very good. The problem is that the total effect of all this, 1 billion people working towards a common goal, was to cut 10 tons of CO2, or what one American puts out in 6 months. We postponed global warming by the end of the century at about 1/20th of 1 second. That's not doing good. That's not solving global warming. That's simply feeling good. I would like to talk about how we actually do good, how we actually make strategies on global warming that will work. And that means we need to remove our myths. We have a lot of miscomprehensions about what will happen with global warming, but they're often not right. They're often very panicky. They make us feel, oh my God, the world is coming to an end. But if it's not true, it's unlikely we're going to make good judgments if we feel that we have a gun to our heads, when in reality, we don't, and I'll get to that. And then, lastly, we need to remember, if we're going to spend money, we need to spend it well, because we can only spend it once. If we spend money poorly on tackling global warming, that's money we can't spend well on global warming and other strategies or other problems. So let's remember, if we over-worry about some problems and if we panic and do bad decisions some places, we end up under-worrying and doing poor choices on other issues as well. So we need to get the conversation on global warming right. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about. Now, of course, if we're going to talk about global warming, no version is complete without a picture of Al Gore. So here it is. Al Gore and I gave a talk on a presentation to the US Congress a couple of years ago, where we were trying to put forth very different views on how we should deal with global warming. Now, the point that I'm going to try to make to you is that global warming is a huge and unwieldy subject. Now, Pat Michaels and many others are going to talk more about the science to you afterwards. I'm a political scientist. I worry much more about the effectiveness of what we actually do, of the solutions that we focus on. So I'm going to talk mainly about how do we think about global warming, how do we deal with global warming, and how do we spend our money well. So what I would like you to go home with is really just 4 simple points. It's not very complicated. Yes, global warming is incredibly complicated in some ways, but I think we can boil it down to 4 fairly simple points. And if you take those 4 points home with you, I've done my job. The first point is global warming is real, it is man-made, it is important, and it is something we need to tackle. So this is not a discussion of, oh, is it all made up kind of stuff. And we'll have more of that conversation later. But fundamentally, I think we actually need to remember to say thank you to Al Gore for having put global warming on the agenda. I'll get back to why we should also be a little cautious about how we think of Al Gore. But fundamentally, yes, global warming is real. I would argue that our best information comes from the UN climate panel, the so-called IPCC. This does not mean that the IPCC is perfect, as I think Pat is also going to be focusing on later on, but it's still our best source of information. And it tells us that we will see, because we're going to burn fossil fuels, we'll put more CO2 into the atmosphere, we will see temperatures rise. The likely temperature rise is about 2.6 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, higher than the temperature is now. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, but because it's a global average, it's actually a significant increase. And so we got to ask ourselves, how bad is this? Well, if you ask economic models, they look at all the impacts of global warming across the next century and try to summarize it all. Their estimate is, and of course there are many different estimates, but they are in the order of magnitude of about 15 trillion, or about $15,000 billion. That's the total cost of global warming. It gives you a sense of proportion. $15 trillion is a lot of money. It certainly ought to make us sit up straight in our chairs and think, all right, how are we going to fix this problem? But it's also important to put it in context. $15 trillion against what? Well, if you look at the net worth of the 21st century, that's about $3,000 trillion. So we're talking about half a percentage point of the 21st century. That's an important problem, but it's by no means the end of the world. It gives you a sense of proportion. Global warming is real, it's man-made, it is important. On the other hand, it's not the most important problem that will ever face us. It's half a percentage of the 21st century. Let's by all means get it right, but let's also not panic. And that means we need to start thinking about what should be our smart strategy. So first point is really just global warming is real, it's man-made, it's important, it's not the end of the world. Second point, and I wish all 4 points were as quick, because then I'd be done real fast, but I'm going to take a little more time on the second point. We're often told vastly exaggerated and one-sided stories. You may have heard about the problems of some of the predictions of the UN climate panel, but actually I think those are rather smaller issues. They are there, yes, but much more importantly is the general tenor of the conversation that's often framed in almost panicky and Armageddon-like terms. That's unhelpful, both because it's wrong, but also because it leads us down the wrong policy path. It makes us choose the wrong policies. Let me show you what I mean. Al Gore and many others tell us that global warming is going to be terrible. This is what he has said in the movie, but of course many, many others tell you this almost daily in the news, in the media, and TV, and print. He tells us global warming is a planetary emergency. He tells us we have just 10 years to avert a major catastrophe that could send our entire planet into a tailspin of epic destruction involving extreme weather, floods, droughts, epidemics, and killer heat waves beyond anything we've ever experienced. That doesn't sound nice. That actually sounds like something we want to avoid, right? But what we have to ask ourselves is this correct? Is this a good way to inform the conversation? And I would like to show you why very often it's not. Actually, that on many of these very particular accounts, we're being fed a very one-sided, negative, and unhelpful way to look at global warming. Let me show you just 4 points. Let's try to look at heat deaths. Al Gore says we're going to see more heat deaths. Well, from killer heat waves, well, let's take a look at heat deaths. Let's take a look at sea level rise. He talks about more flooding. He talks about hurricanes, more extreme weather. And he talks about infectious diseases. Let's try and take a look at malaria. Let me try to walk you through just those 4 simple points and show you how very wrongly we're being informed. It doesn't mean that there's not some truth to it, but it does mean that I think you will find that you are being misled in the way that we should be thinking about global warming. First up, heat deaths. Al Gore and many others tell us as temperatures rise, we're going to see more people dying from heat. That's absolutely true. It's very obvious. If temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves, and because of more heat waves, we're going to see more people die from heat. It's really not very complicated. But the crucial point, of course, is to recognize how many are actually going to die. Well, we have the best studies from Europe. They actually indicate, for instance, for the UK, that there's, by 2050, estimated because of global warming, to die each year about 2,000 more people because of increased heat deaths. That's certainly important to know, and that's certainly important to inform people about. But what is curious is that we are not being told that as temperatures rise, we're going to see more heat waves and hence more heat deaths. But as temperatures rise, we're also going to see fewer cold deaths, and therefore fewer people dying from cold. Now, if that was a trivial number, maybe it wasn't interesting, but it's not. It's actually not so. Virtually everywhere in the world, including here in South America, more people die from cold than from heat. So it is important to ask, well, how many more are not going to die from increased temperatures? It turns out that for Britain, the number of cold deaths avoided by 2050 is estimated at around 20,000 people. It would seem to me that telling us, oh my God, 2,000 more people are going to die, but forgetting to tell us that 20,000 fewer people are going to die is not a good way to inform the debate. And again, let's remember this is not just true. You know, I'm from Denmark. Maybe we would like it to be a little warmer. But fundamentally, this is true for the entire globe, or almost everywhere. And not everywhere. Sub-Saharan Africa actually will see more heat deaths. But if you look at the only global estimate that we have, it shows that about 400,000 more people are going to die by mid-century because of global warming, but about 1.8 million fewer are going to die from cold deaths. We need that information. So fundamentally, we're being told only part of a story, and a very misleading part, by telling us more people are going to die from heat waves, true, but many fewer are going to die from cold waves, which is also true, and important to know. But the second part I would also like you to bear in mind is, how are we being told that we should then deal with this problem? By cutting carbon emissions. That's the standard solution anywhere from Lula and everywhere else around the world, telling us the solution to all the problems is cut carbon emissions. But is it really? Is that the best way to help people who are going to die from more heat waves? Well, no. We know that there are much better solutions. Take a look, for instance, for the US. Virtually no one dies in the US because of global warming. Why? Because of air conditioning. If you care about people dying from heat waves, you should give them air conditioning. You shouldn't start cutting carbon emissions. It's really very simple. If you want to avoid people dying, give them air conditioning. Now, of course, a lot of people are going to feel uncomfortable about that because that means more emissions of CO2, and that's true. But remember, most cities around the world have seen increases in temperatures over this century that are higher than the temperature rises we're expecting because of global warming in this century. Why? Because most cities consist of a lot of asphalt and very little greenery and water. That means they're much warmer than their surrounding countrysides. Tokyo, for instance, is 12.5 degrees warmer than its surrounding countrysides in August each year. So clearly, if we want to do something about heat, and most people, about 80%, are going to be living in cities by the end of the century, why don't we do something about that? It's really very, very simple. If the problem is that there's very little water, or there's very much black surfaces, why don't we fix that? For instance, London, we have looked at that. If we invest more in putting water features and putting greenery back into London, we would actually reduce heat wave temperatures by about 8 degrees centigrade, or more than twice what we could do through global warming policies. And it would be cheaper, it would be more beautiful, and it would work right away. And of course, if the problem is black surfaces, as you have many of here in Sao Paulo, why don't we do something about that? Imagine if we actually painted some of the rooftops or the tarmac, the asphalt, the roads white or in lighter colors. We could actually reduce heat time temperatures by about 10 degrees Celsius in London alone. Again, the point I'm trying to make is, first of all, we're being told that more people will die from heat, which is true. But we've failed to be told that fewer people are going to die from cold, which is just, or even more, important. And we're also being told that the only way to solve this problem is to cut carbon emissions, when in reality, if we want to help people with heat, we should invest in air conditioning and in making cooler cities. It's really very simple. If we want to do good, we have to ask ourselves, how do we do that in the best possible way? Instead of just towing the party line, if you will, and saying the politically correct thing, oh, cut carbon emissions no matter what the problem is. We have to start asking, what's the smart way forward? And it's exactly the same thing for the other things I was talking about. Al Gore tells us there's going to be more heat deaths, but he fails to tell us there'll be many fewer people dying from cold, and he fails to tell us that we could do much more good by investing in cooler cities. The same thing with the other problems. He talks about we're going to see more flooding. Yes, we are going to see sea levels rise. We estimate that, and this is again the UN Climate Panel, that sea levels will rise somewhere between 18 and 59 centimeters over this century. The most likely, the median estimate, is about 30 centimeters. Now, 30 centimeters is not nothing, but it's not the Al Gore expectation of 6 meters. I don't know how many of you have seen Al Gore's film, but even if you haven't, you've probably seen the most famous cut from his film, where he shows what 6 meters of sea level rise will do. It'll essentially wipe out most of Florida, most of San Francisco, most of New York, most of Holland, most of Bangladesh, most of Shanghai. It's a very long movie, and most of Beijing. But the problem, of course, is it's not the right number. The right number is 30 centimeters, or about 20 times less. We need to keep our measurements correct if we're going to tell people what's the problem. And how much of a problem is 30 centimeters? Well, we know. Because over the last century and a half, sea levels rose by about 30 centimeters. Did anyone notice? Imagine asking a very old person who've lived through most of the 20th century and ask her, what were the important things that happened in the 20th century? She'll talk about the world wars, the suffrage for women, the IT revolution maybe, but she will not say, and sea levels rose. And it underscores the point that dealing with sea level rise on this size is something we do. We do it fairly automatically. It doesn't mean it's costless, but it does mean it's not the end of the world. And again, of course, let's just remember what is actually going to be the impact if you, for instance, take a look at the Maldives. The Maldives often are pulled out as an iconic issue of global warming. Well, if sea levels rise, the Maldives are going to be gone. Well, actually, what will happen if we see a 30 centimeter sea level rise? Well, if you just look at the Maldives as they are now, they'll actually flood 77% of the Maldives, and the total cost to the Maldives is going to be about 121% of their GDP. That's bad. But of course, that also assumes that the Maldives will do nothing against sea level rise over the next 100 years. Why would they do that? It's a little bit like assuming that I will be standing on the beach of the Maldives in 2020 and watch the sea waves lap up over my knees and then say, if I'm going to stay here another 80 years, I will drown and then just stay there. Now, of course I won't. Well, actually, first of all, I'll probably move, but more likely, we will build defenses, just like the Maldives survived the last 150 years sea level rise of about 30 centimeters. So of course they will deal with this. And actually, if you take into account that they can protect very large amounts of their dry land, it actually turns out that for less than 0.04% of their GDP, they can safeguard virtually all of their dry land. Now, the simple question is, will they spend 0.04% of their GDP to avoid a loss of 121% of their GDP? And the answer is, of course. So again, we have to remember that sea level rise is real, but it's not the end of the world. And we actually know very well how to deal with it. Again, take a look at the idea that we're going to see ever more hurricanes, that we're going to see ever more damaging impacts from extreme weather. It's an argument that's very often brought up. Al Gore obviously had it on the cover of his movie where he showed a hurricane coming out of a smokestack. But in reality, is that what's going to happen? Well, take a look here. What you see is basically the increase in damage costs for the US. We have the best evidence for the US from 1900 until today, or 2009. Basically what you see is there's virtually no damage in the early parts of last century, and then a dramatic increase culminating in Hurricane Katrina that leveled much of New Orleans in 2005. Of course, everybody thought this was just going to keep going up and up and up. And that's probably true. But it has very little to do with global warming. It has everything to do with the fact that more people live close to where hurricanes hit, and they have much more stuff to be damaged. So fundamentally what we're seeing here is a social implicator, not a global warming indicator. It's very simple if you think about it. The US population over the last century quadrupled, but the Florida coastal population in the same period increased 50-fold. So it's not surprising that when hurricanes hit, they're going to cause a lot more damage. Let me show you a picture here. This is Miami Beach in 1926. Is it fairly clear that if a hurricane hits here, there'll be some damage, but not very much? Is it also fairly clear that if it hits today, there will probably be somewhat more damage because of hurricanes, because of the social factors involved, not because of hurricane increases. So what we're actually seeing is mostly because of social factors. So some researchers actually said, well, let's take a look at this graph, but ask ourselves, what would the damage have looked like if all the hurricanes of the last 110 years had hit the US as it looks today? That is, if all the people with all their stuff was there when all these hurricanes had hit. And notice a very, very different picture emerges. That is what it would have looked like instead. Notice it's no longer such that the biggest hurricane is Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Actually, the biggest hurricane is the 1926 hurricane that ripped right through downtown Miami. Actually caused more deaths back then, even though there were very few people, than Hurricane Katrina did. But because there was virtually no stuff to damage, as we saw in the picture, it was not a very high impact hurricane in terms of money. But had it hit the US today, it would have been the costliest hurricane of all. Much, much more costly than Hurricane Katrina. Actually, the second largest hurricane was the hurricane that hit the Galveston in 1900, which killed about 8,000 people, many more than were killed in Hurricane Katrina. And only the third largest, there's also a couple of other hurricanes here, the third largest of Katrina, about $80 billion, was Hurricane Katrina. So again, let's remember that we're being told a story that fits very well with the idea that this is the end of the world. But in reality, what we see mostly is the increase in social factors, many more people living where hurricanes hit with much more stuff to be damaged. Now, there will probably be increases in hurricane damages simply because hurricanes will become not more frequent, they'll probably become less frequent, but they will become a little stronger. So yes, global warming will probably increase the damage cost, but very little compared to social factors. Let me just show you, this is the estimate of what we're expecting by mid-century. Because of because of climate change, damage costs will go up about 10% by mid-century. But because of social factors, that more people will live closer to harm's way with more stuff, we expect that to go up by almost 500%. Again, why is it we're so focused on cutting this little one and so little focused on cutting the huge increase of about 500%? Why is it that we consistently focus on the wrong solution? Lula and everyone else wants you to believe that we should be focusing on this. Well, actually, if everyone, for instance, did the Kyoto Protocol and did so all the way through the century, which is 20 times more than what the world has managed to do so far, we would be able to cut about half a percentage point of this, half of 1 percentage point of this 10% damage cost. Not very much. If we focused on very simple things like better regulation of where people were allowed to build and better building codes, that is having more secure houses, making sure that we didn't subsidize insurance so that people build irresponsibly, and that we talked about how could we have better warning of hurricanes, we could probably cut this part by about 250 percentage points at very low cost. Again, why is it we focus on cutting half a percentage point over here at very great cost when we focus so little on cutting much, much more at much lower cost? Again, I would argue not only are we being misinformed about the science, but we are also being misinformed about what is the best policy option of tackling future damage impacts. Again, if our goal is to do good and not just feel good about ourselves, why is it we don't focus on the policy solutions that will actually fix the problem? The last point I just want to mention in the Al Gore, the typical worry about global warming, is the idea that we're going to see more infectious diseases. We have most of the information on malaria, and let's just take a look at that. Yes, malaria is weakly correlated to heat. So as temperatures rise, we expect that there will be more likelihood that malaria could extend its area of infectiousness. That's possible. We're actually expecting that by the end of the century, we will probably see about 3% more malaria than we would otherwise have seen. 3% more malaria than we're seeing today. But of course, we're seeing 100% malaria already now. Why is it that we only worry about a tiny increase in 100 years and so little about the fact that many, many people, about 1 to 2 billion people each year, experience malaria, and more than 1 million people die from malaria? Malaria is weakly correlated to heat, but it's very strongly correlated to wealth. If you're poor, you get malaria and you die from malaria. If you're rich, you don't get malaria, and even if you do, you don't die from it. So again, the question is, why is it we only focus on the thing where we can do something about malaria through global warming? Well, let me show you the cost of that implication. Let's actually take a look at what are the two typical sort of approaches to dealing with global warming, to dealing with malaria. One is to cut carbon emissions and do something about malaria that way. The other one, of course, is to deal directly with malaria simply by distributing more mosquito nets and distributing medicine to deal with malaria. If everyone did the Kyoto Protocol, again, 20 times more than what the world has managed to do, and we did this all the way through the 21st century, the net impact, if we run the models, would be to save about 1,400 people from dying from malaria each year. Now, I would like to help save 1,400 people from dying from malaria every year. But I wonder, why is it we're so focused on just saving 1,400 lives, when if we really care about malaria, if we focused on malaria policies, we could save every year somewhere in the region of 850,000 people from dying from malaria. We could save so many more people. And oh, by the way, the cost would be much, much cheaper. The average cost estimate of the Kyoto Protocol is about $180 billion a year, whereas the malaria-specific policies are estimated to cost around $3 billion a year. So to put it very, very starkly, for every time Al Gore and climate change politicians would be able to save one life from dying from malaria. The same amount of money spent on malaria policies could save 36,000 lives from malaria. And my point is simply, isn't it better to save 36,000 people from dying from malaria than one? Isn't that what we mean when we say we want to do good rather than just feel good? So again, the point here is not to say that there's no truth to global warming, or that there's no truth to the impacts of global warming, but that we are very often being presented with a very misleading impact. We're being told more heat deaths, but we've failed to be told fewer cold deaths, and we're being told there is a very specific way we need to deal with the problem, namely cut carbon emissions, whereas the answer is, if we actually care about these problems, it's about dealing with many simple policy solutions. Yes, they're not as sexy, but they're much, much more effective, they're much cheaper, and they're much more likely to actually be enacted. So make sure we make cool cities before we cut carbon emissions. Make sure that we deal with sea defenses before we focus on cutting carbon emissions. Make sure that we deal with making homes more secure against hurricanes before we cut carbon emissions. And make sure that we deal with malaria through bed nets and medicine before we cut carbon emissions. That's the basic message. So, yes, global warming is real, it's man-made, it is important. But the way it's being presented is often dramatically misleading, and it gives us bad policies. And that's where I want to turn as the third point. Right now, we're being asked to do poor policies that have little chance of being enacted, that have huge costs, and will actually do very little good for the future. Why do we not start talking about how could we actually deal with global warming? So let's just take a look at the current solutions, the way that we typically talk about them. The Kyoto Protocol, the only protocol that we have said yes to so far, tells us we should cut carbon emissions in much of the Western world. Even if we did so cost effectively, the cost would be about $180 billion a year. Yet the benefit would be very tiny indeed. We're expecting a reduction in temperature of about 0.004 degrees centigrade. Of course, the world has actually not lived up to its promises, so now the reduction will be even smaller. That's a ridiculously low temperature reduction at a very high cost. Shouldn't we start talking about how we do this smartly? The problem is, that's not how most people react. We actually had Brazil's climate ambassador here yesterday, and he was telling us what is Brazil's plans for the future. And it seemed curious in the way that he simply said, yes, we failed in the past. Yes, this is not working very well. So let's try it again. Let's try to do the same failed policies that haven't worked for 18 years. Let's try to do them again. I'm simply wondering, what kind of land are we talking about? A place where we do not listen to past experiences, where we do not listen to what the economic models tell us are the actually best investing points, but simply keep on with failed policies. Kyoto failed, yes, but before Kyoto, Rio failed. I don't know if you remember, but in Rio in 1992, most of the industrialized countries promised to cut their carbon emissions, yet the OECD did no such thing. We overshot our emissions by 12%. In Kyoto, we promised to cut our carbon emissions by even more, and we overshoot by even more. We'll probably overshoot by about 25% in 2012. And yet, everyone got together in Copenhagen last year and said, ooh, Rio didn't work, Kyoto didn't work, let's try again. Of course, not very surprisingly, it failed in Copenhagen, but now everybody says, oh, okay, it failed in Copenhagen, let's go to Cancun and make it happen. Or if not Cancun, then let's go to South Africa. And I understand that it's nice places to go, but I don't understand why we keep looking at the wrong end of the policy spectrum. And notice, it's not just Kyoto that's wrong. We actually also know the EU, being big on promises, have actually decided that they're going to cut carbon emissions by 20% by 2020. And we're actually going to do it in the least effective way too, because we're going to increase our energy share of renewables by about 20%. Yet if everyone in the world did this as the EU proposes, the cost would be about $7,000 billion in total. And the net benefit to the world would be to cut temperatures by the end of the century by about 1/50th of 1 degree centigrade. That's ridiculous. It's bizarre that we have all these conversations about spending huge amounts of money and doing virtually no good. The economists try to recapture this in a very sensible way. They say, for every dollar you spend, how much climate damage do you actually avoid? And the answer turns out to be that for every dollar spent on the EU proposal, we would avoid about 4 cents of climate damage. That's a poor way to spend a dollar. Imagine every time you spend a dollar, you do 4 cents worth of good. Why don't we try to do it better? But of course, in Copenhagen, everyone signed up, including Brazil, to a target that sounds really, really nice. Namely, we're going to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade. But actually, if you look at the estimates, and we have run these estimates, all the macroeconomic models show that this would be fantastically expensive, if at all possible. If everyone did it right, this means that all politicians did all the right things across the century, across all nations, in a perfectly rational sense, which is possibly a slight over-expectation from politicians. If everybody did this, the cost by the end of the century to live up to this target would be in the order of $40,000 billion a year. A cost of $40 trillion, or about 13% of GDP every year. Of course this is not going to happen. And this is not just one model. These are all the macroeconomic models that we have in the world, all the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum models. And every time we spend a dollar, the models show that we would only avoid 2 cents of climate damage. I would simply like to engage you in thinking about why is it we continuously believe that we're going to follow bad policies when we haven't done it in the past, and that analyses show that they are very, very poor ways of spending money. I would like to engage you in thinking, are we ever going to make that happen? And the answer, of course, is no. Why? Because cutting CO2 is actually costly. If you take a look, this is just an empirical study of the last 25 years. If you look at how much you've grown over the last 25 years, these are all the countries in the world. So some countries have actually grown poorer, but most countries have grown richer. This is an average of the annual growth rate. Somewhere between 0 and 5% is the most likely for most countries. And this is how much their CO2 has grown. What you see here is there's a very simple correlation. If you get richer, you produce more CO2. Or to put it differently, if you try to reduce CO2, chances are you will grow less, which of course is also what the models show us. Actually, Brazil, just to give you a sense, is right there. You're a little bit above the line, that little dot there. So you're no different. Everyone grows and produces more CO2. And that's because we don't burn fossil fuels for fun. We don't emit carbon emissions just to annoy Al Gore. We do it because it powers our society. It powers our life. I mean, there'd be no electricity here. It would be a lot hotter in here. You wouldn't have been able to come to this conference if it wasn't for fossil fuels. I certainly wouldn't be able to come here. We wouldn't be able to do any of the things that power our civilization. That's why telling most countries to say, hey, could you cut back on your CO2 is a loser, because no countries want to do that. All countries want to say they want to do it, but they're not going to do it. And that's why I think we need to recognize there's a systematic reason why our promises keep failing. Politicians will keep making them because we applaud every time they make the promise, but they're not actually going to deliver on them. So maybe it's time that we start thinking about, is there a smarter way forward? And the answer is yes, there is. Before I give you that answer, let me just tell you one other story, which I think encapsulates much of the global warming debate in many ways. Polar bears. How many of you look at polar bears and think global warming? It's a great example of how we've been sold a story that has a little truth to it, but a lot of falsity and a lot of false implications to it. Global warming will probably damage polar bears, yes. We expect that as there will be less summer Arctic ice and eventually disappearing summer Arctic ice, polar bears will be harder hit, yes. But let's just remember two things. First of all, polar bears are not endangered right now. Actually, the polar bear population, the global polar bear population, has increased about 4 times over the last half century. Most people don't know this, but it's important to recognize. They've actually increased, but they will have problems in the future. Yet, my problem with this argument is that everybody seems to say, well, if polar bears are endangered, we got to cut carbon emissions. Why is it nobody tells you how effective that's going to be? Well, what could we do? We could do the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, we haven't done that, but even if everyone did, if everyone implemented the Kyoto Protocol all the way through the century, how much would that actually help polar bears? Nobody tells you, and I think I know why. Because it's not very impressive. Every year, if everyone did the Kyoto Protocol, we would save about 1 polar bear. Now, I'm all for saving a polar bear, even at a couple of $100 billion a year. But the problem I have with this argument is, isn't it curious that the only solution to saving polar bears that we can think of is to cut carbon emissions? Yet we know every year we shoot polar bears. Why don't we stop shooting polar bears? And it's not a simple, trivial matter of a few polar bears. Every year, the world shoots somewhere between 300 and 500 polar bears. I don't know about you, but it would strike me to be a smarter solution to stop shooting 300 polar bears first, before we enact very expensive and very unlikely legislation to save 1 polar bear. So the point here is really to start thinking about what are the smart solutions before we think of the politically correct ones. It is that we start engaging and thinking what actually works, what will do good, instead of just making us feel good. And that's the trick to thinking about the smart long-term solution to climate change. Right now, everybody talks about we need to, for instance, put up many more solar panels. The problem is there's plenty of energy to power all of the world with solar panels, yes, but they're incredibly ineffective. They're incredibly costly. So the question really is, do we really believe that we're going to get a lot of people to put up a lot of solar panels that are incredibly inefficient, that are incredibly costly? Or should we rather focus on making solar panels much, much cheaper into the future so that everyone will buy them, including the Chinese and the Indians? So the real point here is to say, do we want to buy a lot of inefficient technology now, or do we want to make that technology efficient for the future? That is the real trick to dealing with global warming. Right now, everybody seems to say, let's buy the inefficient stuff, which of course means you get a few well-meaning, mostly Westerners, buying solar panels, mainly to prove how good people they are, but it's not actually going to solve global warming. If we want to solve global warming, we should make solar panels much, much cheaper so that everyone will want to buy them. Now, of course, this is not just about solar panels. There are lots of different solutions to this, but the trick, again, is to make sure that we actually dramatically increase our research and development into green energy technology. The Copenhagen Consensus, I helped bring together some of the world's top climate economists, 28 of them, and 3 Nobel laureates in economics, to look at all the best solutions on dealing with climate change. And what they told us was the best long-term strategy is to invest dramatically more in research and development into green energy. If Brazil and everyone else promised to spend 0.2% of their GDP on research and development and demonstration into green energy technologies, we could actually solve global warming at a much lower cost than what we're talking about today. It would be about $100 billion a year. It'd be twice as cheap as Kyoto and be 50 times more effective. Of course, I don't know whether it's going to be solar, and I think we should look at a lot of different technologies, most of which are going to fail, but that's okay, because we just need some of these technologies to work out so that they will power a low-carbon future. The amazing thing is, this would actually fix global warming in the medium term, and this is perhaps the most important part, for every dollar you spend, you would end up avoiding $11 of climate damage. We would do 500 times more good than the standard solution of cut back carbon emissions to reach the 2 degrees centigrade limit, which would pay back 2 cents for every dollar spent. We can do so much more good if we start thinking smartly. So fundamentally, my message here to you today is, let's start doing something that actually works, something that's cheaper, and something that will actually have a long-term impact on global warming. And then let's remember all the very simple solutions to the problems that everybody says they worry about. For instance, heat deaths, for instance, sea level rise, for instance, malaria and hurricanes. Let's make sure that we actually deal with the problems that are here right now, instead of just focusing on cutting carbon emissions. The last point I want to make you, and then I will shut up, is yes, global warming is real. It's often vastly exaggerated, and that's why we need smarter solutions. It's also just, let's remember that there are many other and more important problems in the world. Just to give you a sense of proportion, Al Gore and many others will tell you that fixing global warming is our generational mission. Al Gore talks about this as, how do we want to be remembered by future generations? I think that's exactly the right question. How do you want to be remembered by future generations? Al Gore and many other people seems to say that they want to be remembered for having spent $180 billion a year doing virtually no good 100 years from now. I doubt our kids and grandkids are going to thank us dramatically for spending a lot of money and doing virtually no good. Just to give you a sense of proportion, the UN tells us that for about half this amount of money, or about $75 billion, we could do all major basic problems right now. We could give clean drinking water, sanitation, basic health care, and education to every single human being on the planet, and we could do it today. So the real question here also is, what would you rather be remembered for? Spending twice as much money doing virtually no good 100 years from now, or spending half that amount of money and do all the great things today? So let's not get carried away with global warming. Global warming is real. It's a problem we need to tackle, but focusing on it exclusively, focusing on it with poor policies, is not only likely to waste a lot of money, but it will also take our attention away from the many other problems there are in this world of ours today. So let's remember all the other problems we need to fix. And then when we talk about global warming, let's spend our money well. Let's spend it on adaptation, on climate change, and let's spend it on research and development to actually make sure we have the technology to fix the future of climate change. Thank you very much.